know that I don't preach anything too far different from what my dad preached. And I'll say this. I was asked earlier today, are you going to church tonight? No, I'm not just going. I'm going to go preach. I can't think of anything that Dad would rather have me do than preach. He would have said, you better get to your church and preach. So it's good to be with you all. We'll continue on in our series. Last week we started a lesson called the membership of the church, and of course by that we mean that the membership of a church needs to be a saved membership. We use the term regenerate membership. And if I forget to make this announcement later, I talked with Brother Draper earlier, and he wanted me to mention to you all and remind you all that their conference is next week, starting Monday night at 7 o'clock, going through Wednesday at noon. And I think all the meals are provided. Y'all know, y'all have all been there before, so that's not new for any of y'all, but go and show your support if you are able. Anyway, Acts chapter number 2, we'll do a real quick review of some of the material that we covered last week, and I'd say that historically Baptists have always believed that salvation was necessary for baptism, and that baptism was necessary for membership in a church. Therefore, salvation was necessary for membership in the church. Now, that seems like it would go without saying, but it really doesn't, because there are a lot of groups that do not practice that, and they get into difficulties, they get into troubles, they get into trials, and we'll look at that a little bit later. By a regenerate church membership, by a saved church membership, we mean that the church is composed of baptized believers that have banded together for the purposes of evangelism, edification, and exercise of their spiritual gifts. They also perform the two ordinances. Unbelievers, or those who do not give a satisfactory testimony of their salvation experience, may not become members of a Baptist church. They are welcome to attend, but they cannot be accepted into the membership. Now, it's often said that that is a distinctive amongst the Baptists. We are one of very, very few groups that insist upon a regenerate church membership, and we demand as much as can be known that those who apply to be members in a church must have professed Christ as their Savior. That's been historically the Baptist position ever since the New Testament. So we talked last week very, very quickly about three things: the construction of the church, the community of the church, and then the covenant of the church. And so I'm going to review those really quickly. We had a lot of folks that weren't here last week, a lot of folks gone traveling, and so just by way of real fast, real quick review, let's read Acts chapter number 2, one of my favorite sections. This, of course, is at the end of Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, starting in verse number 41. Luke records for us, then they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day were added unto them about 3,000 souls. And they continued steadfast in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and in prayers. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. And all that believed were together, and had all things common, sold their possessions and goods, imparted them to all men, as every man had need. And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart, praising God, having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. I don't want to replow the old ground that we've done last week, but I do want to make sure that we go back over it and quickly mention a few things. The New Testament is very firm and very clear in its teaching concerning baptism and salvation being prerequisite for church membership. Every time that churches are mentioned in the New Testament, it's the Greek word ekklesia. 115 times it is translated church, only 3 times is it translated assembly. But that is a gathering of the citizens that are called out of their homes into a public place, into an assembly of the people that are convened at a specific place for a specific purpose. Okay? We read to you right there in those verses, Acts chapter 2, the example of the Jerusalem church. And that example of the Jerusalem church also gives us the appropriate order for church membership. Specifically, verse number 41. Then they that gladly received his word, that is salvation, were baptized. That's obviously baptism. And the same day were added to them about 3,000 souls. That is church membership. The 3,000 souls that were added, they were added to the church. They were added to the group of believers, that covenant community that was already existing in Jerusalem. And so you have there the appropriate, the designated, the biblical church order. And that is, first is belief, then is baptism, and then is the brotherhood, then is the belonging to the church. We have the same example of the Corinthian church that we talked about last week at length, so we're not going to do that again this week. We said there was community within this church. It gives us evidence that the early church acknowledged the concept of membership. There was both accountability. This is what we talked about in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. There was accountability for, there was a man there that was accused of adultery. Specifically, he was accused of incest. And the Apostle Paul said, put this man out. Put this man outside of your membership. He gave very specific, very clear instructions on how to do that. Then in 2 Corinthians, the letter that he wrote later, he said, it's enough. Sufficient was the punishment that was inflicted by all. And so he says, basically take this man back. And so I want you to see that church membership is self-governing, okay, under the principles of God's word, but it is a self-governing community. That's the third, then, is that there's a covenant. We mentioned last week that we're given instructions on the construction of church, how to assemble a church, on the community of the church, and the third one then is the covenant. That membership requires more than just association and more than just assembly. Those are required, but there's something more required. It's a commitment, a covenant that is required. And we referenced our church covenant. If you don't have one, I have multiple copies here that I'd be glad to give you one. When you join this church, when you apply to membership in this body, in this covenant community, in this fellowship of believers, you agree, you assent to be bound by our church covenant. If you don't agree with the church covenant, don't be a member, because that's what you agreed to be bound by, okay? And we looked through that last week. Again, if you want my notes on that, I'll be happy to share them with you, but we looked through that last week, and we read the whole covenant. We read some specific verbs in there, and I gave you verses where those things came from. Where are those actions in our covenant derived from the scriptures? I'd be happy to sit down with anyone and show you that. Where we left off last week. This is a fast summary. I preached long last week, and I'm almost done with the summary part, which is all just introduction for this week. Verse 42 of our text. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and in breaking of bread and in prayers. I'll say that I believe those are activities within the church. Steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, there's teaching. The fellowship, there is, we said, talking. In breaking of bread, there's tasting, and in prayers, there is thanking. Those are things that happen within the church. When you move down a little further, verse 46, they continued daily with one accord in the temple. Again, that references their worship. Breaking bread from house to house, that represents their fellowship. They did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart. That represents their fellowship and their thanksgiving. So we said there has to be teaching, talking, tasting, and thinking. And so I know I stretched that alliteration just a little bit, but we get all four required activities of the believers in those two verses. We also noted their location in those two verses. That's my summary. That's where we left off last week. So I hope I caught everybody up. We're back up to speed now. How are we different? How are Baptists different? What makes us distinct? And that's really what we're studying here. That's why we're going through this series that we've called Faith of Our Fathers. What makes us different from other groups? Why are we called Baptists and not by some other name? Why is it that we hold that name, and what is that series, what is that belief, that system of doctrines that we hold to that makes us different from everybody else, distinct from everybody else, and I would say more discerning than everyone else, because others aren't. Well, let me tie this concept of a saved church membership, a regenerate church membership, to what we've studied previously about the divergent views regarding baptism, because that's really where the crux of the matter is. We remember that we studied before that many denominations, many folks that claim to be Christian, practice infant baptism. They practice various forms of baptism that are not what we know as believers' baptism, those that make a profession of faith first and then follow Christ in baptism after a profession of faith. You see that obviously by those that baptize very small children or that baptize infants. The deviation concerning a regenerate church membership is tied to that, because all of Christendom, if you will, all Christians in general, believe that baptism places you into the church. But if you're baptized and you become a church member, Baptists believe that you must be saved before you're baptized, and then you're baptized and become a church member. Everybody that's in the church is saved, right? But if you believe that you can baptize infants, or you can baptize those that are not saved, hoping that they would be saved later, and when you baptize them and they become a church member but they're not saved yet, do we have a problem here? You see how that develops into a problem almost immediately based upon your practice of baptism? And so a lot of groups have this divergent view in practice because of what they believe of baptism. And I'll say this: there is no other group that can force Baptists to maintain our church membership. There is no other group that can force us to be lax concerning our enforcement of a regenerate church membership. The errors are internal errors. They come from inside. Most of them come from good intentions, but they're internal errors. Let me go through some of these errors. The first error that we see based upon unregenerate church membership is what I call drive-through. Ever heard of drive-through church? Drive-through church. Now, by saying drive-through church, I'm not referring to the types of services that many churches were forced into having in our recent history, in the last year or two, because of COVID restrictions. We've all had to implement different things because of this crazy virus that has invaded everywhere in the world. And so we've had different churches that have canceled service, or had parking lot services, or had, YouTube services, or different things like that. Now, different study for a different night, that's not church. Man, I hear some great preaching from that stuff, but that's not an assembly together, okay? Different subject for a different night. That would be drive-through worship. But drive-through church is a little bit different. It's the phenomenon that we see today where we just drive through, but we never get involved. We don't engage. We come to church, but we don't engage the church. Remember the covenant that we studied last week? We agreed to maintain family devotions. Well, we can do that, right? But we agreed to support the membership. We agreed to, how was it that it said that? We agreed to contribute cheerfully and regularly, to avoid tattling, backbiting, abstain from alcoholic drinks, watching over one another in brotherly love, remembering one another in prayer, aiding one another. How do we do that if we don't become members? How do we fulfill that if we don't get involved and plug in? I mean, I don't know how to pray for you if I don't know you. Brother Roger, I'll apologize, and I'm going to use you for an example. And I didn't ask your permission first, but I think you'll be okay with this. The last several services, I have reminded you all that Brother Roger has a very dangerous job. Pray for Brother Roger and pray for his crews, that they'd be safe. If I didn't know him, would I know how to pray for him? If I didn't know the danger that he faces daily on his work, would I have any clue of how to pray for him for safety? Or would I even know that he needed special oversight from the Lord for a safe harvest? I got to know him. I got to know you if I'm going to know how to pray for you. You got to know me if you're going to know how to pray for me. That's what this covenant is talking about. That's what you don't get with drive-through church. You see, we have a bunch of people that drive through but never get involved, and so many towns and counties and regions and different places now have multiple churches. You know, we see here in the Bible where Paul addresses a letter to the churches of Galatia, and that was a group of churches that were spread out across a region, depending on if you believe the North or the Southern Galatian theory. And so it was a group of churches spread out through a large region. But all the rest of these churches that we know of were a church in a city. We didn't have First Baptist Church and Second Baptist Church and Third Baptist Church. And as another friend like the Heights Baptist Church, New Heights Baptist Church, Greater Heights Baptist Church, and Climbing Heights Baptist Church. We didn't have all that. We have the Baptist church of this city, and people were expected to get along. There was expected to be unity. But now, since we have so many different tiny churches where families don't get along with each other, how can the whole church get along with each other? And so we have a whole smattering of little churches all over everywhere. And if you don't like this one, you can just go down the road and join that one. And about a year or two, when that preacher gets on your pet sin, you can leave that one and go to the next one. And so we have what is called church hopping, where you move from one church to the next whenever it suits you. You know what that demonstrates to us? Lack of commitment. There's a lack of commitment to a single church. Because, see, it's better for us to get involved and to plug in, and no matter how difficult it gets, work through the difficulties. Work through the difficulties and support one church through thick and through thin. I mean, is it anybody's surprise that church unity requires commitment? What did Paul say of the church? Ephesians chapter 5, verse number 32. You can look it up if you like. He said that church is like a marriage. Has anybody here been married for longer than 6 months that hasn't decided, hey, this thing takes work? I mean, Prince Charming, sorry, he doesn't live here. Neither does Cinderella. The fairy tale doesn't exist. Marriage is work. It doesn't matter how nice the guy is and how pretty the girl is and how compatible they are. They can be the best couple ever, and marriage takes work. And Paul says that church is like a marriage. We're a family. And church unity requires a commitment. And the other side of this is some churches are guilty of allowing church hopping. You know how we do that? Well, didn't you have a problem with that church? And then you had a problem with that church? And then you had a problem with that church? And now you want to come here? Go back and fix that problem over there. Or go back and fix just go back where you were and fix the problem there. We don't need you importing your problems here. Wow, I'm going to get in trouble, ain't I? Let's move on. We'll leave drive-through, and we'll come to denominational thought. Now, y'all know we believe in the independence and the autonomy of a church. Now, this week we're talking about the membership of the church. Management of the church is coming next, so we're going to talk about this particular issue at length. But I'll say this. Sometimes we start thinking of ourselves denominationally. And I would say that maintaining a regenerate, a saved church membership is not an easy task. There are times when folks get offended, folks wear their feelings on their sleeve, and they get offended by the notion that church membership is not just open to everybody. Church membership isn't open to anyone and everyone who just wants to walk in the back door and says, hey, I want to be a part of you. Many, I would say most Christians believe that their personal spiritual condition is an intensely individual and a purely private matter. And so nobody else has the right to evaluate my spiritual condition. May I tell you that the Bible disagrees with that? I mean, judge not that you be not judged is frequently taken out of context. I'll say this. No individual can confidently or completely understand the spiritual condition of someone else. But since we know false professions are so common, we have to be careful. We must be careful. Now, ultimately, it is the Lord that places persons into membership. It's the Lord that places members into a specific church. It is the Lord that takes members out of and removes members from the church. How do I know that? Because it's the Lord's church. I think I've said it before. It's not the pastor's church. It's not the largest family's church. It's not the leading family's church. It's not the former pastor's church or the future pastor's church. It is the Lord's church. And final judgment on these matters is always reserved to the Lord. However, we do strive as much as possible to maintain the purity of our membership. And there are some requirements to membership. And we've mentioned covenant. But there are some other requirements to church membership, and some churches combine these things into three. I've got four here. 4 requirements for membership. First of all, there must be a clear testimony. A clear testimony of your salvation. A clear testimony that you have placed your faith in Christ. You could also call this a confession. There must be a confession of faith. And that question of your confession, that question of your testimony must be answered candidly and completely. If you can't give a clear and complete and candid testimony of your conversion experience, then my advice, regardless of who the person is, would be to examine your salvation. Make your calling and election sure. And we're happy to have members. We're happy to have more members. But we want, dare I say, sheep, not goats. We want to fill the church with good members, saved members, submissive members, not rebellious members. So first of all is a clear, complete confession of faith. Second is complete immersion. Complete immersion, complete baptism following conversion. And so first being conversion and second being immersion, and in that order, okay? Not baptism and then conversion. It must be conversion and then baptism. The next two are fairly simple to describe, but they're not always simple to enact. Number 3 is central doctrinal agreement. Now, I said central doctrinal agreement. I did not say complete doctrinal agreement. Wow, since everybody's being real patient with me tonight, can I just say I can look out from here and I can see that we don't have complete doctrinal agreement on every issue? We don't all have the same dress standards. We don't all have the same Sabbath standards. We don't all have the same many standards. And can I say, that's okay? That's okay. We have central doctrinal agreement. We don't have to agree on every single issue. We have to agree on the important issues, on the fundamental issues. Fourth, covenant submission. As we stated last week, we went through it at length, there has to be an agreed submission to our church covenant. That takes care of almost all of the others, doesn't it? There has to be covenant submission. So that's the four that I have: a clear testimony of faith, complete immersion, central doctrinal agreement, and covenant submission. Now I have a friend who summarizes it quite differently. A friend of mine summarizes this with 5 points. He said every church needs to have a good report card, so there's 5 essentials. And like a good report card, there needs to be 2 B's and 3 A's. And so he summarizes with 2 B's and 3 A's. He says it like this: you have to believe in Christ, number 1, in that order. Number 2, you have to be baptized by immersion, in that order. Believe and baptize. That's your 2 B's. 3 A's. You have to attend our services, agree with our doctrine, and accept our leadership. Those are important words. He doesn't say you have to accept the doctrine and agree with the leadership. He says you have to agree with the doctrine and accept the leadership. Big difference between those two, isn't there? Why is there the difference? Because we can submit even when we don't agree. We need to agree on the central doctrinal issues. And we must attend the services. That's the 3 A's. Now, I'll share with you a note here from a commentary that I was using. So this is not original with me, but he said that Baptists, because of their belief in both the priesthood of the believer and soul liberty, those are concepts that we will study in future lessons in this series. Because of the Baptist belief in both the priesthood of the believer and in soul liberty, Baptists have tended to allow room for divergent views in their membership. That's a good thing, right? He says it's interesting to note, however, that some churches demand absolute agreement on certain side issues, like dress standards. He goes on to mention a lot of them here, but like dress standards and different things. He says, yet they tolerate those who diverge from the church's official position on very important doctrinal matters like eternal security, eschatology, and other things like that. Have you ever thought about that? And don't worry about the big theological terms there. What he's saying is sometimes we expect somebody to agree with us down to the jot and the tittle, cross your T's and dot your I's the exact same way I do on what? What color car you drive. You don't think Baptists fight about that? They sure do. Sure they do. We'll argue over how long your skirt has to be, if you want to be a member. I have known churches that won't let a preacher preach if he doesn't have a black King James Bible. Like the red one is not any good. It's got to be a black one. I'm not kidding you. You can't wear corduroy pants because that's sinful. Wire-rimmed glasses are forbidden. You have to have a white shirt with a tie, or you can't preach. Now, usually there's underlying issues behind those sort of dogmatic statements. But we argue and we get very dogmatic over the smallest, petty little things. And then, big things like, some of the big doctrines. Oh, you don't believe in eternal security? Well, that's okay. Just come on in. You can learn it later. Excuse me. No. That's an essential. We need to agree on those sorts of things. I know. I've meddled enough. Let me move on to my next point. Discouraging trends. Some discouraging trends that we see amongst the Baptists. And I read these from a website that you can go to. It's the Center for Baptist Studies. Some trends regarding Baptist polity regarding regenerate church membership. The policy or polity of regenerate church membership has cost Baptists dearly. We have paid the price in blood in history, throughout history. Baptists are the primary group that tenaciously defend the concept that every person should have the freedom of conscience, the freedom of their own conscience. It used to be at one time that the federal government believed that each individual person should have the freedom of their own conscience. Baptists have paid for that with their lives. It is called soul liberty. We're going to devote an entire lesson to that in the near future in this very series. But along with that doctrine of soul liberty, it is the Baptists which have insisted that only saved persons, only regenerate persons could be members of the church. In other words, we do not compel you to be a church member. We do not compel you to be baptized and to become a believer like us. We want you to. We try to convince you with biblical reasoning, but we do not compel you. However, unless you are a believer, you cannot be part of our group. You cannot be a member. That is contrary to almost every other group. Today, there are many Baptists that have not remained true to their history nor true to their heritage, and they have not maintained the purity of the church. And sometimes, or most of the time, there is so much that is at stake. Why has that happened? Think about the age that we live in. Toleration is prevalent, right? It seems like today we tolerate everything except for Christianity. Non-judgment is prevalent in society. Judge not that you be not judged. How many times have we heard that misapplied and misquoted and used out of context? So we're told we have to tolerate everything. There's another discouraging trend, and that is we want to grow the church. Now, understand this. I'm all for new members. I want new members, and I want church to grow. But a desire to increase the numbers at any cost causes many Baptist churches to forget that you're supposed to be diligently guarding the church, that you only allow a regenerate church membership. You know, we just want to count numbers. We don't care who else comes in, just as long as we build the numbers up. There's groups like that. I think they go astray. Closely related to that one is the high-pressure evangelism that you see amongst certain groups that especially target the baptism of very young children and target them for church membership. It's a frequent tactic to increase church membership, and again, it's the desire to grow the church. It's the desire to increase the numbers and to count the numbers. I'm just going to blow the whistle on some preachers. Some preachers are like that. And when they get together at conferences, they want to tell how many they got saved that year and how many they got baptized that year. And the bigger the number, the better they are. And they get together and they compare their notes. I don't know any of those. Well, I do know some of those personally. I would say this. I don't fellowship with any of those, okay? I know some guys like that. They're not guys that I hang out with. They're not guys that I preach for or have preach here, okay? Now, I'm not against numbers. But there's got to be more than just getting numbers, okay? So when I say that it's the church growth syndrome, I'm not against church growth. I'm all for church growth, and I want us to grow, but I want us to grow the right way, not just increase numbers, okay? And we can get numbers, but we want members, not just numbers, which is the last thing here, which is pedo-baptism and pseudo-baptism. There's a growing trend to accept persons into the church as members of the church that came from other denominations. That's pedo-baptism, or denominations that do not hold to a regenerate church membership. In other words, those that have practiced pseudo-baptism, a baptism that's not real, not true. See how that gets you into trouble? See how one error leads to the other? When you don't practice baptism right, what do? You wind up with lost members in your church. And when you don't practice baptism right, and you do this over a consistent number of years, and you do this for generations, you wind up with more lost in your church than you do saved. And then you wonder why there's church fights. And you wonder why, when you try to have a vote on something that is sane and rational and seems to be very spiritual, it's 50-50. Well, why is that? I mean, and trust me, I understand. I don't think that every church vote ought to be 100%. In fact, if every church vote is 100%, you've got a different problem. We'll talk about that one too next week when we get to the management of the church. Well, we got some humdingers coming up. Y'all pray for me, okay? If everything's always 100%, you got an issue. But if everything's always 50-50, you got two groups that are at odds with each other, and that's a problem. You know what you should have? I mean, honestly, you should have, by and large, almost everybody in agreement. And on this issue, you might have one or two people say, you know what, I'm just not so sure about that. That's not what my experience has been. But I'm willing to learn, I'm willing to grow, I'm willing to go with the group. And on the next issue, you should probably have most of the group together. And maybe the issue after that, you got all the group together, but you got one that says, you know what, we did that before, it didn't work out too well, but if y'all think that way, we'll go there. You got one over here that's not sure about everybody else. And then the next time this lady's in with the rest of the group, and you got this fellow over here that's not sure. You know what that shows? Number one, people are thinking. Number two, people are growing. And we're growing at different rates because you got somebody just not so sure, but I'm willing to be pulled along with the rest of the group. That shows healthy church growth. One of the essential Baptist beliefs that we've had throughout history is that the church should be composed only of believers. There's a reason for that. When you have unbelievers in the church, you have problems in your church. Always have problems. Can I be so bold as to say, when you have nothing in your church but believers, you got enough to deal with. I mean, we've got personalities, we've got differences of opinion, we've got differences in minor doctrines, and it's difficult enough to iron all those out with believers, with brothers and sisters. When you have false professors in the church, well, that's another story, isn't it? It's almost impossible to work those things out. Those who demonstrate a commitment to Christ as their Lord and Savior are the only ones that are eligible for church membership. Those who can't give a reasonable testimony of salvation, you're welcome. You're welcome to attend. You're welcome to participate. But you're not welcome to be a member. Church membership, as we said last week, it's voluntary, but it's not optional. It takes a commitment. Church membership in a local church is clearly commanded in Scripture, but the decision of whether to obey or whether not to obey that command, well, we believe in soul liberty, don't we? That decision rests with the individual. God expects every believer to identify with and to participate in the ministry of a Bible-believing local church to which they belong, to the covenant community, to the family, to the fellowship of believers to which they have personally committed and covenanted together with. And I know I've mentioned it. If you haven't read our church covenant lately, get it out, brush it off, remind yourself what you've committed to. Because it does us good once in a while to remember what we've promised to one another and what we've promised to do for one another and how we promised to look out for one another. And you know what? That'll also help us remember to submit to one another when we see others helping watch over and look out for us. I was talking to a brother earlier this week, and I said, you know, your race isn't my race. goes back to what we studied when we went through our Philippians series. Your race isn't my race, and my race isn't your race. I'm not responsible for finishing your race, but you know what I'm responsible for? Helping you finish it. I'm supposed to be your cheerleader. I'm supposed to be the guy that gives you the supplies you need to finish your race. You're supposed to be my cheerleader. You're supposed to be the guy that helps give me the supplies that I need to finish my race. That's a regenerate church membership, and that's what we have covenanted together to complete in this community of Christians, in this fellowship of faithful believers. It's important. And I want to remind you that we have promised not only the Lord, but we've promised one another to look after each other with that kind of love and with that kind of a commitment. Let's stand. Brother Derek, if you'll come lead us.